Chapter 60 Bang, you are listening at Novel Full. Audio. If one were to notice a major difference from the Earth humans in this third group, it would have been that their skin shone as if it were covered with golden glitter. This gave a certain aura of grandiloquence to even the poorest caste. As for the aristocrats, they seemed to be directly inspired by a Greek or Scandinavian pantheon. Even according to strict aesthetic criteria, no member of this people could be described as ugly. Their hair was unusually colored, seeming to follow no particular evolutionary logic. Two young women at the center of the formation, wearing long poppy red satin dresses, proudly wore long pale pink hair that Jake had so far only seen in manga or movies. Other nobles seeking their attention had equally zany hair colors and cuts, ranging from pale green to dark purple. Each of them displayed undisguised arrogance, as if they considered their race superior to all others. Despite their apparent contempt, the security perimeter put in place was clearly defensive in nature, with no intention of encroaching on the territory of other human or humanoid factions, nor offending anyone. Apart from these three human groups with distinct physical characteristics, there were a large number of humanoid factions, some of which were far more numerous. Troll creatures 6 meters high, giants covered in suckers with tentacles for hair, scaled minotaurs, a people resembling what the T-Rex might have become if they had evolved into a humanoid form. There were also those humanoid creatures that looked like humans, but on closer inspection they turned out to be of a completely different origin. One of these extraterrestrial species communicated with some sort of disharmonious rattling from some unknown appendage, while their bodies looked like knights in full armor, except that these were plates of chitin which could not be removed. There were also all these humanoid species evolved from animals, many of which existed on Earth. Jake's theory was that on habitable exoplanets, and provided their DNA was carbon-based, there was only a finite number of possible variations. A cat identical to Crunch didn't necessarily exist on another planet, but a group of species with feline-like characteristics. Without a doubt. As for all those theoretical life forms that needed completely different environments to survive, obviously they had probably been shipped to a completely different area. Concluding that the best strategy consisted in ignoring all these wonderful folks, Jake patiently made his way with a neutral expression to an unoccupied piece of land. Of course, their numbers weren't enough to form a security perimeter, and to limit the risks, he chose to set up camp among the groups of humans too few to compete with the first three factions. There were many sub-groups like their own. A couple here, a bunch of friends there. A father and his 2 kids, a whole family, a few old people, but also some lonely vagrants with their faces untidy and full of despair. L.RG altogether, they formed a 4th faction, large enough not to be crushed by the previous groups. But just barely. Sadly, none of these people could boast of having 4 beautiful, vulnerable young women in their midst. If Jake was formidable to anyone who had suffered at his hands, he was just an athletic, 1.8 meters tall young man to all those bullies around. As for the Playboy and Will, they were not worth mentioning. What was bound to happen happened. One of the gigantic, muscular, muddy-skinned barbarians walked towards them with a conquering stride, accompanied by 2 of his fellow mates. With their lecherous smiles and their fiery looks, their intentions were obvious. It smelled like trouble. The one in the middle, a tall male with braided fluorescent hair and beard reminiscent of certain Vikings, pointed at Sarah, thundering authoritatively in an unknown language whose sounds resembled grunts. Wash grav shroom it des grish. Excuse me. Jake frowned in a bad mood. Wash grav shroom. The giant Crow-Magnon commanded again, screaming louder than ever and sputtering like an automatic water jet. No. Jake replied simply, but in a tone that allowed no contest. For once in her life, Sarah was glad that the feminist hadn't progressed to the point where no man would stand up for her. On the other hand, she also realized that the alien facing them only recognized her existence as Jake's possession. Here, only the law of the jungle prevailed. The group of medieval soldiers from another world, on the other hand, seemed to be under the yoke of the 2 long-haired, pink-haired noblewomen who stared at everyone as if they were owed money. Maybe joining them would be safer. Eventually, the decerebrate pile of muscle lost patience and resorted to the only way to settle a conflict and get his way that his rudimentary brain knew. Rajam, Brashta. The alien growled as he reached out his right arm to his comrade, palm open. The latter ran quickly to their camp before returning a few seconds later with a huge archaic club at least 4 feet long, still stained with the clotted blood of his victims. Slavishly and deferentially, the underling placed the prehistoric weapon in his boss's hand, before withdrawing with his spine bent, looking down at the ground. Wagrashed. The alien barbarian uttered a loud war cry as he raised his club to the sky, sparking a standing ovation punctuated by guttural screams from his tribe. When the grunting and screaming ended, he pointed his club at Jake with a smirk on his face and a satisfied smile, before resting his weapon on his shoulder. Everything in his facial expression, from his exorbitant eyes to his fierce grin of a beast showing his fangs, challenged Jake to a duel he believed he was sure to win. After all, the wretched human before him only reached his pecs. "Fuck you." Jake replied, annoyed, barely holding back a yawn. "Trashed." Wagrashed. "Oh, looks like you're not so stupid you don't recognize an insult." Jake muttered with a raised eyebrow. Of the factions enjoying the show, not one of them intended to intervene to resolve the conflict. While some felt compassion for the poor human who was about to be blown to bits by a 30-kilogram club, most were eager to witness the public execution. Jake stared at the faces of the passive audience around him, intending to feast their eyes with obvious irritation. He had only recently made it to the red cube and was already being messed with. Was it really marked "victim" on his forehead? Clearly, since his arrival on this planet and after absorbing the ether and a piece of Digester's soul, he could feel that fear had little hold on him. On the contrary, he had to curb his murderous desires. These impulses were weak, but he could feel that with less intelligence he could have behaved in a very different way. Nevertheless, if there was one thing he was convinced of, it was that by showing weakness here, he might get away with it, but the rest of his group would be finished. Not that he attached any importance to them, but if it was in his power to prevent a catastrophe, he had no reason not to try. "Just looking at you, your species is the kind that has the brain of an oyster in a gorilla's body. Time to show you what magic looks like," he thought strongly. Under the overexcited gaze of the criminals of the second group and the mud-skinned barbarians of the first group, Jake calmly advanced to his opponent. Then slowly, with the same jaded expression, he raised his gun and... bang! Everyone heard the sound of a ripe melon shattering as if it had crashed from the 15th floor. After all his mockery and provocation, the alien skull turned out to be extremely fragile, much more fragile than he imagined. In the astonished silence of the crowd, the muscle mass remained standing for a short time before suddenly collapsing backwards in a big boom. The fight was over before it began. With the same nonchalance, Jake blew on his pistol like a cowboy before approaching the body, picking up the stream of ether that had appeared, and leaving with the same measured step. Chapter 61 Intimidation and Probing. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Even after Jake joined his group again, the silence of the humanoid factions around him lingered. The display of violence was an eye-opener for all these groups for very different reasons. The group of humans led by a gang of thugs, delinquents, and potential lawbreakers was obviously not unduly shocked. If Jake's execution by gunshot showed that he was a ruthless person, whom it would be unwise to underestimate, who among these criminals had never seen a gun? Both factions of extraterrestrial humans were experiencing this situation much more conservatively. The first group was a primitive people technologically similar to the prehistoric Homo sapiens, or even more primitive hominids. Jake's killing was pure magic for them, a feat that even their greatest shamans and sorcerers could not claim to have accomplished. The sound of the gunshot itself was completely foreign to them and reminded them of the sound of lightning striking a stone. The most fragile ones were still dazed by the thunderous sound. By firing a shot, this tiny human had just proved to them how insignificant they were among the various factions and how size was no direct guarantee of superiority. Just a few minutes earlier their debauchery was largely due to the fact that the most massives of their tribe felt completely invulnerable in the midst of all these frail humans. Even the omegas of the tribe had grown wings, a never-before-seen confidence replacing their usual submissiveness. Now the poor, decerebrate primates had abandoned their casual, unrestrained orgy and gathered close together, forming a formation similar to an army of penguins sticking together to withstand a blizzard. The poor abused young women finally had a break, but to everyone's surprise they did not seem particularly traumatized or distressed by their harsh treatment. It was as if everything they had endured was perfectly normal and part of their daily lives. To top it all off, their eyes were bright and their facial expressions were much richer and more subtle than those of their male counterparts, who were just mindless bullies. The intelligence of the females was superior among this species, but their role was reduced to mere outlets, objects of reproduction. Things were different with the medieval faction, always closely protected by its circle of armored infantrymen. Until then, if the soldiers had been vigilant, they were now wearing gloomy faces. While unlike the first group, most of them were smart enough to understand that the death of the giant had been caused by the bizarrely shaped metal object held by his opponent. They had no idea of the sorcery behind such a feat, and yet it wasn't enough to break their spirit. They came from a world where magic existed and only the nobles could master its secrets. The various and varied hair and eyebrow colors generally betrayed their elemental affinities and were mainly hereditary. Their princesses could certainly produce spells of similar power, but the visual effects accompanying these spells were usually spectacular and explicit. A ball of fire, a cone of ice, a lightning bolt, nothing that could not be understood at first sight. Spells capable of killing with a simple noise. It was definitely the first time they'd ever heard of them. As for the other humanoid species, some of them seemed to have too little intelligence to understand what had really happened. Only the sound of the gunshot had struck them. However, Jake wasn't so naive as to convince himself that none of the aliens wanted to harm him. He felt a pervasive hostility, the source of which he couldn't locate. Even if he couldn't find a culprit, there were certainly more advanced species than the Earthlings among them. The lack of clearly identifiable futuristic weapons was no indication of primitiveness. Bioengineering, nanorobotics, explosives, emitters capable of disrupting neurons or inducing hypnosis, drugs. There were 1,001 ways for an extremely advanced civilization to hide its game. In the end, each faction chose to remain neutral. No matter how advanced or confident in their strength a people might be, the largest groups near the red cube did not exceed a few hundred heads. Even the animals usually considered solitary and territorial like tigers miraculously managed to behave properly and regrouped among their fellow creatures. The oracle devices on their paws had certainly not been there for nothing. It was worth noting that most Earth carnivores capable of defeating low-level digesters in single combat had evolved extremely rapidly after their arrival on B842. Some had undoubtedly been transported to this planet weeks or months earlier. In particular, there was a lion larger than a mammoth that was napping in the middle of his pack of lionesses who looked like simple kittens next to him. What a surprise when Jake found out that Crunch had sneaked up to the king of the felines and was now tickling his nose with his paw. Is this fucking cat brain dead? Jake cursed in his mind, sweatling bullets. Luckily, the evolution of this lion had not spared his intellect, and instead of shredding the intruder with a bite like a standard lion would have done, the big feline resumed his nap after having identified the intruder by opening an indifferent eye. Phew, that cat's got a lucky star. He sighed wearily. Concluding that this cat had its own path to follow, he let Crunch play with the devil. When it got tired of it, it would come back. He was aware, however, that the ordeals inside the red cube would vary greatly from species to species. Perhaps the fact that his cat had joined other felines was not so innocuous. After this brief twist, the various factions returned to their tranquility, while Jake and his group got to know the few wanderers or mini-groups that introduced themselves to them. If Jake was always so unsociable, Amy, Sarah, Sophie, Loanna and even the Playboy were more than happy to meet normal people. At least more normal than the thug who had just shot an even bigger thug a few minutes earlier. The couple who introduced themselves to them were, to their great surprise, the owners of the farm they had visited 2 days earlier. The main reason they had taken the initiative to talk to them was that they had recognized their clothes and possessions on Will and Amy. Since they were only a few hundred meters from their farm when they were teleported to be 842, they had found themselves in the middle of nowhere, unable to find their way back. They had obviously tried to use their bracelets to find their way, but due to a meeting with digesters they had been forced to flee to the red cube. Terry the farmer was a 6-foot-tall bon vivant with a head on his shoulders. With the changes on Earth in recent weeks, he had never moved apart from his wife, and never without his trusty shotgun. He had long since run out of bullets, but that had allowed them to survive until then. His wife Maria, a tall brunette in her 30s with sun-tan skin, never went out without a knife or pitchfork either. She wasn't particularly pretty, but she had a well-groomed body and sparkling eyes. They made a handsome couple. Other individuals then introduced themselves one after the other, some friendly and enthusiastic, while others only gave their names out of courtesy or to exchange information. They learned through these exchanges that very few of them had had the chance to witness a blue light reaching up to the sky and serving as a beacon for them. Some had seen it, but had not found the courage or desire to go there, despite the fact that their oracles confirmed that there was no danger there. Indeed, depending on the area of appearance, if the place where the beacon of light was located was safe, the path leading to it was full of pitfalls. The direct consequence was that the majority of them had no idea where they were, what the ether's role was, or even why so many species from different worlds were waiting in front of the red cube. Amy, with a good heart, set out to explain everything they had learned so far, from their encounter with a Slayle to their own discoveries. They were all delighted to hear about Oracle cities, but they were not so delighted when they found out that the nearest one was more than 100 miles away. On top of that, they didn't even have the necessary ether to pay the head tax. Others, on the contrary, were determined to stay at the foot of the red cube to forge themselves a future through the ordeals. After all the chatter, night had finally fallen and Jake ordered the tent to be pitched. He would let the child and the mother sleep in it. As for him, he didn't intend to sleep under the stars. He just didn't intend to sleep at all. Between the primitive aliens of the first group who were going to hate him, the second group full of criminals who had been staring at their bags full of food since their arrival, and all those other humanoid species and carnivores all around him, falling asleep would be like handing over his life to fate. He still had 36 more ether points and more than enough digester blood and meat to last the coming night. Chapter 62 Transaction. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After his lightning victory, the encampments around the red cube regained their tranquility. Jake's group feasted copiously, with the initial core following Jake consuming some digester meat and pink potatoes, while the playboy and his groupies had to make do with canned food. No one complained, but you could smell the resentment and bitterness in Sarah and Kyle. Yet, in the face of their previous disappointments, the two swallowed their saliva rather than make a scene. From time to time, Jake would catch curious glances from other factions, especially in relation to Silvermeat. But he showed a similar curiosity, and discovered to his surprise that many humanoid species dined on similar meat, sometimes with fruits and vegetables he had never seen before. Because of the cyan salt as far as the eye could see, there was no source of wood available, and so, in order to save electric torches or torches for the more primitive ones, the majority went to bed immediately after the end of the dinner. As promised, Jake left the tent to the child and his mother. As there was still room inside, he also let Loanna sleep with them, since the poor girl had not fully recovered from the loss of her fingers. At least mentally, that would leave after effects. As for the others, although they wanted to spend a good night in the tent, they grinned and bore it patiently, aware that complaining for such a futile reason would be the best way to discredit themselves. The sad reality was that the mild temperatures of the day were rapidly dropping once night fell, and enjoying a good night's restorative sleep would be impossible in the open air. When there was no choice, however, most people often proved to be far more resourceful than they thought they were capable of, and Jake's group was no exception. Kyle, aka the Playboy, offered his groupies to sleep together so they could keep warm, which they gladly accepted, Sarah included. Amy and Will didn't know how to behave in this situation, and Kyle didn't dare make the same offer. By looking at Jake's expression, they could confirm that Jake had no intention of sleeping and that they were free to do whatever they wanted. Will, who was not born yesterday, read more about their current situation and decided that he would keep Jake company during his wake. To top it all off, the night sky was getting cloudy. The purple moonbeams and the brightness of the stars were no longer enough to see properly. This made a perfect hunting ground for all these night vision capable life forms, and Jake could see many eyes shining in different colors in the darkness. If he couldn't see much, chances were that most of the humans from the other factions couldn't either. The most frustrating thing was that his ether perception stat peaked at 10.5 points, hardly more than a normal Earth human. With his 11.6 points of body perception stat, he ended up seeing only a pittance better than the others. There was no way he could react if another group was plotting against them and took the initiative to strike them down. When it was nearly midnight, and the rest of his group was long asleep with the exception of Will, who was watching next to him, they heard a rustle of dress nearby. Alert, they both drew their machete and saber, and then relaxed, realizing that this was only one of the noblewomen of the medieval human faction. She was one of two pink-haired beauties wearing a long scarlet satin dress. With the drop in temperature, a black fur coat from an unidentified beast now covered her shoulders. Now that they were looking at her more closely, Jake and Will swallowed with difficulty, their throats suddenly dry. The young woman in front of them was a genuine goddess. Only 5 feet tall and not more than 20 years old, she emanated an aura of charisma and dominance difficult to imagine coming from such a tiny woman. With the ambient darkness, the golden glitter covering her crystal clear skin gave her an almost sacred halo. Her long pink hair reaching to her waist emitted a faint light, as did her irises, also pink. It was the first time Jake and Will had ever seen such a color in someone's eyes, and they couldn't help but be captivated by her charming, seemingly innocent look. To complete the picture, a white gold tiara with the pattern of 2 symmetrical crescent moons joined at their ends repeated itself, the empty space between the 2 moons in the center of her forehead set with a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. An undeniable sign of royalty, which seemed universal whatever 1-foot's world of origin. Jake realized, however, that this was just a preconception. He only had to look at the other humanoid aliens around the red cube to realize that it wasn't always clear who had the authority. For many animals, whether they were of Earth origin or not, there was the typical might makes right attitude among them. The strongest and most intelligent were in most cases easy to identify. For other humanoid aliens, however, it was a completely different matter. With these species of scaled minotaurs, for example, was it the smaller one with long horns, or the larger one without horns that led the horde? Or maybe the medium-sized one with milky white scales? Other creatures looked exactly the same for his untrained eyes. One such life form, for example, had its chitin covered with patches of various colors that seemed painted and unnatural. The only distinguishing feature he could think of was their number, but as far as he knew, it may only be a typical fashion of theirs. Turning his attention to the noblewoman in front of him, he noticed that she was accompanied by 4 royal guards, those who protected the group of aristocrats. Each of them had a watchful gaze and were monitoring his movements, especially the pistol at his belt. Halt! Jake waved to stop 10 feet away. What can I do for you, my lady? Jake was as antisocial as ever, but the exercises with the oracle, the increase in his intelligence and reaction time, and his lack of stage fright since he'd absorbed the digester, helped make him serene and confident. Now that he was no longer influenced by his social anxiety, he was no longer afraid to stare at strangers, and therefore read their expressions much more easily. Ele Velius Boias Cuis Harmida. The beauty declared, pointing the gun at his waist. In doing so, she pulled a purse from the inside of her fur coat, undoing its cord to extract a blood-red gemstone. A red ether crystal. From the sound and volume of the purse, there were at least 10 of them. Jake flinched, trying to maintain his indifference, but his eyes full of envy betrayed how tempted he was. He was torn between the idea of getting a bunch of ether immediately at the price of a gun he would sooner or later run out of bullets with, or playing it safe. The truth was that, even though everyone was unaware of it, he still had 2 spare guns, at least 2 boxes of 9mm ammunition and an assault rifle that he was saving for really dangerous situations. He could perfectly afford to sell one. The problem was not losing a gun, but the fact that everyone would realize in the morning when they saw the young woman with her new gun that he had enough firearms to make a transaction. It meant extra attention that he didn't need. On the other hand, he could effectively do without this weapon, and a gain of ether would instantly boost his chances of survival. Never one to run away from a little bit of trouble, he made his decision quickly. Calmly and attempting to assume his best poker face, he raised 3 fingers and pointed to the full purse with his other hand. No matter how many crystals were in that purse, he wanted triple. With his IQ, even without ever having negotiated with anyone, he knew that ether was the most precious resource on this planet. And if that person was willing to buy his gun for that purse, well, she had to have a lot more. The young noblewoman gritted her teeth in frustration. Contrary to what Jake thought, the young lady didn't seem accustomed to dealing with the likes of him. Perhaps her servants had always dealt with this kind of work before, or she was so rich that she had never needed to cut a price. What Jake didn't know was that the young woman and her sister, along with the entire group of nobles, had been tortured by tremendous anguish since their arrival on B842. The cohesion of their group was on the verge of explosion. Here, on this planet, their magic was not working. Chapter 63 Enya, you are listening at novelfull.audio. The noble young woman was the crown princess of one of the many dukes of the Velsios Empire, which itself was one of the ruling nations on the planet Ega. This planet was older than Earth, larger and more luxuriant. The gravity was therefore slightly higher and the density of life forms was considerably greater too. Humans fought over the most fertile territories against all sorts of creatures, and other humanoid species that the Earth's folklore would not disavow. As a result, the concentration of ether was higher there. Even today, there were many theories in the mirror universe about the origin of ether and what explained its concentration from one world to another. But there was an assumption that the majority of evolvers and players would all admit out of pure experience after a while. The more people in one place, the more ether. And the more spiritually evolved these creatures were, the faster the ether grew. And the more ether, the more these creatures evolved. A virtuous circle. No matter which seed world was considered, any civilization advanced enough would one day feel or detect the ether, and then finally use it. However, there were also universes and planets like Ega, where life forms were so abundant that the ether grew much faster, encouraging changes in the ether code. Living beings not so evolved would thus awaken gifts, which for the natives of these worlds could only be called magic. Like the genetic code, accidental mutations were constantly occurring and the trigger for these was always the ether itself. At least, that's what most people thought and what she was able to reveal. These mutations were most often hereditary, leading to the appearance of bloodlines. Each seed world had a fundamental etheric code, characterizing as a signature every element that was part of it, from an electromagnetic wave to the most elementary particles of matter. This made it easy to trace the world of origin of newcomers to the mirror universe. With enough ether and a bit of luck, this fundamental etheric code could mutate as well. This created myriad worlds with very different ether manifestations. And these mutations were also transmitted from energy to matter. The planet Ega had its ether encoded in a form of elemental ether. Fire ether, lightning ether, water ether, and so on. Regularly scientific mages or the world itself by accident would create new ether particles and soon they became a new standard of this world. After millions of years of evolution, these lucky ones making up the noble class of Velsios had inherited an excellent sensitivity to an elemental type of ether, which was more classically called elemental affinity, among the mages. These affinities being hereditary, one could only feel and control the elemental ether for which one was calibrated. These affinities could easily be identified by hair color, making the detection of innate talent for magic extremely simple. Fiery red hair betrayed an affinity for fire, heat, or blood, and white for light, healing, and purification. This double affinity gave pink hair and was extremely rare on Velsios and an excellent omen. If Jake knew all this, he would probably ask himself, why is it such a cliché? After all, the fire wasn't necessarily red, the blood could be yellow or green and the light could take on any color. So why were the same preconceived ideas and concepts found in free web novels and video games from Earth? Well, he'll think about that another day. The final word was that the young noblewoman couldn't detect any of the elemental ether particles she used to manipulate to cast her spells. It was the problem of a code, whether genetic or etheric. It programmed our traits and behaviors, but we had little or no control over them. If we took the oxygen out of the air, we would all continue to breathe for a while, and then suffocate. It was consciously impossible for a human to filter nitrogen and CO2 from the atmosphere or switch air molecules as the primary fuel. It would take millions of years of evolution, the creation of advanced technology, or a genetic manipulation of the whole body. Either way, it was out of our reach. At least for inferior human species. Since their arrival on B842, their guards had dealt with the most common dangers. Unfortunately, such a large group could be spotted from afar and was a real magnet for digesters. In the course of their journey, they had faced entire hordes of these monsters and their numbers had been cut in half. On a few rare occasions, the digesters were so numerous and so strong that the intervention of the nobles and their magic had been necessary. Unable to regenerate their mana, they had been forced to use their own reservoir of elemental energy. Energy that they could not renew once lost. Although her status as the daughter of a duke gave her the highest authority among this group, the Velsios Empire was a society that recognized the superior authority of the mages because it was based on a very real power supremacy. As soon as it was revealed that the nobles were running out of power and would soon become the equivalent of normal humans again, mutiny would undoubtedly break out. The 4 ducal guards accompanying her were like uncles to her, having watched her grow up from the cradle. And yet, even to them, she had not dared to explain clearly the reason for this late visit. Without her powers, she and her sister were just women with a more trained physique than average. Instead, she had vaguely mentioned that she imperatively needed to satisfy her curiosity in case their faction met enemies with such weapons. What's that? Is it yes or no? Jake urged her impatiently. The young woman seemed completely lost in thought. Returning to the ongoing negotiation, she closed her eyes for a moment before reopening them, decided. Ele Vilius Elstzacni. The lady nodded, taking out 2 more purses identical to the first, much to Jake's surprise. Those big factions were really something else. What he had obtained in battles of life and death, a young and perfumed woman in a satin dress could easily obtain it just by letting her subordinates do the work for her. Inside, Jake was gloating. His first negotiation was a success. A whale like that, he had to bleed her a little more. This woman probably had her own circumstances, but he had his own. The second stage of his plan was the natural continuation of things. Showing her how the weapon works, to finally introduce the concept of ammunition and thus negotiate a second deal. Communication proved to be difficult, and when he drew his gun to show her how to operate and maintain it, her 4 guards responded by drawing their own swords, believing their lady was threatened. After raising both hands in the air as a sign of peace, and a nod from their princess, the guards reluctantly sheathed their weapons. Demonstrating how the weapon worked was then relatively easy, although it was not certain that she understood the part about the safety catch. It would be foolish if the bullet didn't leave at the fateful moment. Jake's magazines could hold 12 to 20 bullets and were manually reloadable. As for his ammunition boxes, they contained 300 rounds of ammunition each. In the end, Jake, with Will's help, managed to sell 2 fully loaded magazines and about 100 rounds of ammunition for 40 more red crystals. In total, after counting the crystals from the first 3 purses, they had obtained nearly 100 ether crystals, which at this point was a real fortune in their eyes. "It was a pleasure doing business with you, Enya," she said with a slight bow, her goddess face deeply relieved and grateful. Then, hearing no answer, she turned around and disappeared into darkness, the 4 guards in her wake. Jake didn't know if it was a farewell, a thank you, or her first name, and the asocial he was had not been able to answer when she looked at him like that, despite the good counseling of his shadow guide. "Jake," he whispered in the night, long after she was gone. "Eh." But instead it was cries that answered him, bringing him out of his torpor. Chapter 64 Ambush. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ah! Let go of me. Jake and Will were instantly on alert, recognizing the screams of Sophie, the nurse with the UV-charred skin. Seconds later, the yells of Loanna, Sarah and Amy combined with those of Sophie, adding to the confusion. Quickly, screams rang out from all sides around Jake. The 4th faction of humans, composed of solitary wanderers, couples, or mini-groups, was attacked by an unknown enemy. Visibility was almost nil with no light source or campfire, the purple moons and stars being shrouded by a cluster of clouds. Nevertheless, the duo forced themselves to keep their cool and rushed towards the rest of their group, hoping it was not too late. However, Jake didn't forget to absorb the ether crystals with the compress function of his oracle device, not forgetting to give a dozen crystals to Will for his assistance. A few crystals could mean the difference between life and death. In order not to wake up the rest of their group and thinking they were relatively safe with all the other wanderers camped around them, Jake and Will had thought it wise to isolate themselves about 20 meters to stand guard and complete the transaction with Princess Enya. A mistake that should have been of no consequence, since this distance could be covered in 1 or 2 seconds with Jake's new statistics. Unfortunately, in this particular case, it backfired. The night around them was so dark that he could only see a little further than the tip of his nose despite the activation of his flashlight. A few meters before reaching the tent in which the child, his mother and Loanna were supposed to sleep, a sudden feeling of terror overtook him. Bang! A hole 1 centimeter in diameter appeared in his left shoulder, despite his attempt to dodge. Had he been a hair slower, the bullet would have hit his heart. The impact was so intense that he was stopped dead in his tracks and thrown to the ground in the opposite direction. Before he could even take stock of what had happened, Bang! Will, who had just witnessed the shooting on Jake, had had enough time to dive for cover, but a bullet pierced his thigh anyway, sending him waltzing away in a heart-rending cry of pain. "Fuck!" Jake grunted as he clenched his teeth, the pain preventing him from thinking straight. He'd never been in so much pain in his entire life. Luckily, now that they were on the ground, the shooter in the dark no longer seemed to consider them a threat. Will didn't look any better, and his femoral artery had been hit. He was losing a lot of blood and was struggling to stop the bleeding by squeezing the wound with both hands. The cries of the camp became more and more panicked and terrified, soon replaced by sobbing or pleading. Howls of rage or noises of fighting also reached their ears, a sign that not everyone had given up the struggle. "Let go of my mommy, you monsters!" shouted a familiar child's voice amidst his mother's outraged sobs and screams. A thud was heard and he was not heard again. Bang bang. "Raph, Hamish, shoot the bastard. He got one of our guys." Miraculously and much to Jake's surprise, the playboy had grew some backbone and had joined the fight with the help of his trusty Colt. Bang! The sound of a grown man collapsing to the ground reached his ears. They had gotten the playboy too. All the men in their group had been shot, and he didn't know about Amy and the other girls. The voice he had heard spoke clear English and could only belong to a member of the second group, since each solitary person of the fourth improvised faction had greeted them one by one upon their arrival, and he was confident that this voice did not belong to any of them. In any case, though he may have been in agony and had almost died in vain, his fear of death was soon replaced by an unbridled anger at himself and his helplessness. Even though he had an IQ of over 200 and stats well above the average human, he had been fooled like a rookie. With the darkness, he still had no idea what the shooter looked like and what weapon had been used against him. The only thing he was sure of was that it was a powerful weapon, probably a sniper. Without the oracle path still active to ensure his survival, he would have seen absolutely nothing coming. Nevertheless, the screams were beginning to subside, and the screams of Sophie and Loanna that he had heard were moving away from their camp towards the second group's camp. The blitz attack by their attackers had been an overwhelming success. Yet fate did not give Jake the chance to avoid the conflict. Sounds of boots were approaching his position and regularly he would hear the sound of stabbing or throats being slit. Henchmen were approaching them to finish the job. As though he would just let himself get screwed up without having a say in the matter. Without even bandaging his wound, he spent the entirety of his ether to deal with the emergency situation his body was facing. At the same time, he grabbed and uncorked his bottle full of digester blood and sipped a good half-liter as fast as his swallowing allowed. After giving a dozen red crystals to Will for his commission, Jake had the coquettish sum of 112 ether points to spend. If these criminals thought he'd be easy prey, they were in for a nice surprise. Will didn't have the same freedom of action as Jake, but he also reacted quickly. Sipping his bottle full of digester blood as well, he had immediately consumed the ether crystals to increase his constitution by 3 points again. In an instant, he had felt his head stop spinning and his breathing had slowed down. The wound was still serious, but with the synergistic action between his constitution and digester blood, the wound was beginning to clot. However, he was out of play for a while. As for Jake, he was preparing to kill his first human. The barbaric, brainless alien from earlier didn't matter. To him, the latter was no different than the digesters. And whoever was plotting to kill him was no different either. First of all, his wound had to be contained and blood loss had to be stopped. 40 points immediately went up in smoke into his constitution, plus 10 points. He immediately felt how his bones, muscle fibers and skin became more tenacious, resisting the hypoxia and inflammation caused by the gunshot wound. As his red blood cells became able to hold more oxygen, his immune system and endurance improved significantly, making the injury seem almost benign. 24 more points were also invested in his vitality, plus 3 points. This investment hurt his heart, but the constitution stats only made him more robust, enduring and resilient, yet only marginally accelerated his regeneration. The digester blood in his possession was no longer of first freshness and only amplified his vitality by 70%. He had to make up for this difference in order to close the wound and renew the lost blood as quickly as possible. Of course, this would not be enough to put him back on his feet completely. Even with a tenfold increase in his current vitality, such a wound would need at least a full day to heal completely. Even though Will appeared to be healed, he still coughed and complained from time to time about pain in his right lung. What he was aiming for was immediate clotting in less than a minute, even if the clot would burst at the first violent effort, and an acceleration of his regeneration mainly to be ready to face whatever the future might hold for him the following day. As for the remaining points, even if he wanted above all to increase his intelligence, it would be of no use to him in this situation if he could not react in time. Even if intelligence also improved the reaction time, agility had the same effect at a lower cost. There were certainly nuances that he did not know, but he did not have the privilege of worrying about them. More perception would have been more than welcome on this moonless night, but 3 more points would drain all his ether without having a decisive impact. It was safer to play it safe. Of ether's remaining 48 points, he spent 30 more on agility, plus 15 points, and the rest on strength, plus 18. This time the effect was really noticeable. The gravity that had always drawn him to the ground seemed to have disappeared and he felt twice as light as before, his strength having more than doubled. The gain in agility was extremely confusing. He now perceived the flow of time around him 3.2 times slower than a normal human being. His reflexes, flexibility, coordination, dexterity, precision and balance had achieved levels of prowess that he never imagined he would be capable one day. Even knowing that this was possible with ether, there was a difference between imagining it and experiencing it. He felt as if he had traded his carnal envelope for a better one. He had never been very supple, even while practicing the exercises of his shadow guide over the last few months, but now he felt like his bones were as ductile as rubber, his stiffness totally gone. His ether status now looked like that. Ether status. Strength, S. 34, plus 18, points, agility, A. 31, plus 15, points, constitution, C. 26, plus 10, points, vitality, V. 16, plus 3, points, intelligence, I. 11 points, perception, P. 10.5 points, despite his injury, he now felt invincible and the enemy was upon him. The time had come to get his revenge. Chapter 65 So I Can Be Wrong Too. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After raising his stats that much, Jake felt like a new man. Lightweight, stronger than ever and tireless. Even with his shoulder wound, which had just stopped bleeding, his predatory instincts had overridden his fear. Hearing multiple footsteps approaching, he continued to play dead, preferring to make sure the sniper had really left the scene. The still erected tent of his camp hid his sight from the battlefield cleaners. The metallic smell of blood and the stench of urine and sweat were attacking his nostrils. With his sight impacted by the darkness, he was unable to determine exactly what had happened. How many had died? How many were injured just like him? And how many had been taken prisoner, like the women in his group? Did they kill only those who resisted them, or were they only interested in women and food? A criminal group of this size must have been severely short of food and resources of all kinds after several days on B-842. Regardless, it was not his problem. Whoever attacked him and his belongings had to be prepared to suffer his retaliation. Will was also playing dead, although he continued to press on his thigh wound. Then finally, a boot sank into the salt sand a few inches from his face. When the minion was about to finish them off, or at least make sure they wouldn't return from the dead, Jake took action. With his military knife in hand, he quickly straightened himself up into an uppercut position, impaling his opponent from nuts to stomach, while lifting him off the ground by 1 meter. It was one of the most atrocious deaths ever, and Jake quickly got out of the way so he wouldn't be urinated on when his victim's sphincters would loosen up. The target of his attack was still alive, but he was so tetanized by the pain that only a congested face in a grimace of agony stared at him with an overt incomprehension and resentment. A few seconds later, the gangster fainted and died. The amount of ether that appeared on his body was more than he imagined, almost as much as a digester LVL2. This meant bad news, since it implied that even the average minion in this group had harvested a significant amount of ether. Crouching down, Jake set out to ambush the opposing group's cleaners one by one using his hearing to spot them. The second cleaner was safely eliminated, choking in a pool of blood, with his throat cut. The third was stronger and heard it coming. Bad luck for him, he couldn't see any better than Jake and raised his arms to protect himself by adopting a boxer's guard, which wasn't smart in the face of a machete hitting at full speed with all the weight of his handler. He was tougher than expected, having surely increased his strength and constitution. His machete failed to cut both forearms and got stuck in the bone. However, the impact was violent enough to knock him down, and continuing on his way, Jake stuck the dagger held in his free hand right into his heart. Despite the fatal blow, his opponent continued to struggle for a long time before finally letting go. It was a tough nut to crack. Even with his newfound strength, Jake was exhausted and dripping with sweat. His gunshot wound to the shoulder was hurting like hell and bleeding once again. 5 ether points. Jake was amazed at the large flow of energy entering his bracelet. almost as much as a young digester LVL3. And he was just an underling. His face was gloomy. The chances of saving Amy and the other women in the group were dwindling by the second. Attacking the enemy base and risking everything, or retreating and licking their wounds. Bang bang, more shots rang out, coming from the direction of the criminal camp. It would seem that they too were under attack. If he could shoot this sniper and know how he was spotting them in the dark, he was confident he could turn the tide. Almost at the same time, a whistle blew. The few footsteps approaching his position, and probably attracted by the dying yelps of his last opponent, suddenly made a U-turn, rushing at full speed towards their own base. The threat had to be serious. Taking advantage of the diversion, Jake sprinted back to his tent, which had held out, only vestige unscathed from the abduction of the women and provisions of his group. The 5-year-old child was unconscious, but when he connected his bracelet to his own, he was able to confirm that other than a slight concussion, the boy was not seriously injured. It was probably best to let him sleep for the time being. A few meters further on, the playboy's corpse lay curled up in a fetal position, his hands clutching a bloody wound in the middle of his belly. Checking his condition, Jake realized he was still alive. The kidnappers were so confident that he would not escape, that they had let him bleed to death in silence. Still, it was without counting on his rage to live. Having kept the bottle of digester's blood that Jake had left them at the farm with a note on it, Kyle had waited for the attackers to bite his jacket and walk away so that he could hold back his groans of pain. Then, once he was sure he was out of danger, he had drunk the blood bottle, before faking his death when he heard footsteps again. Lucky for him, it was just Jake. He was off the hook. At least, he hoped he was. With difficulty, he got up, but the bullet was still in his belly. Even with digester's blood accelerating regeneration, it would only get worse if he didn't remove the bullet. Jake had already removed his own with only his fingers, simply by relying on the gestures of his shadow guide. As he became more intelligent, he synchronized better and better with the shadow guide, so that he could feel the gestures instead of having to imitate them after careful observation. Will, on the contrary, did not dare to remove the bullet since it had perforated his femoral artery. To remove it prematurely without precaution would only aggravate the bleeding. More importantly, he didn't have an agility stat like Jake's that gave him excellent dexterity and precision. Therefore, he could only stay on the ground and wait for them to return. Playboy, what's your name again? Jake asked him, scratching his head in embarrassment. Inwardly indignant, the playboy in question could only laugh bitterly. Kyle Gibson. Okay Kyle, are you ready to come with me and save these girls who are relying on you? From his response, Jake's decision would change dramatically. If he refused and chose to ensure his own survival, Jake would attack the criminal base alone but with the sole intention of saving Amy. He wasn't particularly fond of her, but he had his own sense of values. If someone trusted him enough to follow him, he would take care of that person. If that person had useful qualities, it was all the more worthwhile. As talented as Jake could be, it was an illusion to hope to dominate this planet alone. At least, it was too soon. The group that had just attacked them was living proof of that. Tyrannical, because they had the numbers and the equipment on their side. Deep down, Kyle was terrified and wanted to keep playing dead. But when he saw Jake's icy cold snake eyes, he felt it was a test, which if passed, could also become a life-changing opportunity. Oh, screw it. He was a man, too, after all. If he had to run away all his life in shame and fear to save his miserable skin, was it really worth living? The difference between a civilian and an evolver, he hadn't forgotten. To have privileges in the mirror universe, you had to fight for your freedom. I will fight. Kyle finally answered, his face grimacing between the urge to fight and the urge to flee. Oh, are you sure about this? Jake couldn't believe it. He was sure the guy had been a pathetic self-centered jerk up to now. So he could be wrong too. Absolutely positive. The playboy confirmed, this time with a resolute expression. All right, then grab that gun, we got people to kill tonight. And take these ether crystals, too. You're gonna need them. Jake gave him his gun, with 2 full mags. These few ether crystals he had found when he searched the body of his third victim. 7 red crystals. Nothing much to be excited about, but to a normal human like the playboy it could make a huge difference. Since you'll be depending on this weapon tonight, I advise you to increase your agility by 3 points to improve your precision and dexterity, and put the remaining point in the strength. For the rest, you must immediately collect and use the ether from every target you shoot down tonight if you want any chance of seeing the sunrise. Kyle nodded, extremely focused. Aside from the red crystal given to him by Aslael, which he had already used, this was the first time he would increase his agility. And the effect was incredible. The world was slowing down around him, and he felt in control of his body like never before. He felt a little more confident now. After that, followed by Kyle, Jake returned to his backpack that he had left outside the camp where he had negotiated with Enya. Relieved to see that none of the attackers had picked it up, he went inside without further ado to pull out a Scar rifle in front of a stunned Kyle. Did this guy rob a gun shop or something? The playboy wondered inside, shaken still. Jake still had a third gun, but this time he intended to be prepared for anything. There was no room for chance for what they were planning to do. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, retrieved some magazines and kept the new gun loaded in his hand, all set for battle. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 66 Freeing the Girls. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Prior to their vendetta, Jake instructed Kyle to stay calm while he was removing the ball from his belly and dressing his wound. The playboy, his face pale and dripping with sweat, tried as best he could to endure the surgery in silence, but to no avail. Tears came to his eyes, despite his own promise to himself to look good and stay strong, the whole thing interspersed with half-stifled squeaks. Jake didn't have time to stitch his wounds, and the bandage would have to do for now. The playboy had used his oracle well when he was shot, though. His reaction, amateur as it was, had allowed him to spare his vital organs. Faking a fatal stomach wound had, with the help of darkness adding to the confusion, saved his life. When the young man had recovered his breath and regained some color, they set off, Kyle following Jake cautiously, clutching his new weapon with both hands. He knew that at the first shot fired, they would be spotted. Leaving the initiative to Jake was still the best plan. As they made their way to the criminals and delinquents' camp, which was less than 100 yards away, they found Terry, the farmer, crawling on the ground in rage and grief in the same direction as they were. He had both of his knees broken, his legs forming abnormal angles. His head was also bleeding. He had taken a good blow, but it had not been enough to knock him out. The poor man was giving all he had for the sole purpose of saving his wife from the hands of these kidnappers and would-be rapists. His love and devotion was more than admirable. His wife probably meant everything to him. With a sigh, Jake forced the farmer to drink from his digester blood canteen before forcing him to retreat. Let me handle this. If we can save your wife, we'll bring her back. As if relieved, the farmer smiled in gratitude before fainting for good. We're moving on. Jake just said in a sinister tone, which sent shivers down the spine of the playboy. Bang 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 bang, tada. As they quietly moved closer to the enemy camp, gunfire became more frequent. However, their camp seemed perfectly peaceful. Better equipped than their group, the prominent members all had their own tents, with 3 large canvas pavilions in the middle spacious enough to live in. The duo could now hear the sound of voices and plaintive yells as they approached. Male voices discussing and commenting on their comrades' blitz operation and rejoicing over their spoils, but also female voices sobbing and calling for help. Men were also sobbing and imploring, some of these criminals having clearly switched sides. Their slaves and other prisoners and victims were sleeping in the cold out in the open, huddled together. From time to time one of the men would come out of a tent to grab one of the women outside in more or less good condition before dragging her inside the tent. The shouting and pleading would then start all over again. Jake had to squeeze Kyle's shoulder hard to keep him from doing something stupid. It wasn't time yet. Now that they were in place and the sniper and some of their forces were busy elsewhere, it was time to take advantage and act quickly. The first step would be to take out the soft targets one by one without alerting anyone. With the exception of the central pavilion from which a faint glow was escaping, presumably that of a smartphone flash, the camp had no source of light. With such a large group, hogging the smartphones and turning them off to save their batteries was the first decision they would have to take if they wanted to keep a source of light at night for a long time. Shushing Kyle, Jake snuck to the farthest tent in the camp where guttural grunts of pleasure escaped, mixed with tears. At least he didn't recognize the voices of Amy and the other girls. Holding his breath, he cut an opening in the canvas with his knife, only to bump into the back and hairy buttocks of a naked man pressing and thrusting back and forth his tiny weenie into the poor unwilling woman beneath him. Well, not exactly the patient type either. Jake immediately offered him the privilege of being penetrated without consent too, the only difference being that it was a military knife with a 30-centimeter blade, which he stuck in the middle of his throat, from left to right. With his windpipe and vocal cords severed, the rapist died within seconds, a gurgling sound full of resentment testifying that he did not like being on the receiving end. Karma. There was almost an incident in the execution of his rescue that could have ruined everything. The young woman who had been raped a few seconds earlier started to panic when warm blood splashed in her face. After all, with the darkness and all those aliens out there, Jake's intervention was scarier than anything else. He barely intercepted her scream of terror, placing the palm of his hand against her mouth while shushing her agitatedly. Feeling that it was another man, she calmed down. After several days of mistreatment in the midst of this group, she knew that as long as she remained attractive, no man would intentionally want her dead. She could even take advantage of it. "You're free. Wait a few minutes in silence, then you can run away," he whispered to her, trying to be as pleasant and accommodating as possible. Not exactly his forte either. Afterwards, Jake continued murdering minions resting, eating or fornicating in their tents, reaping a sizable ether loot. 2 of them took more than a minute to die, and this even after their carotid arteries had been severed, a sign that their constitution and vitality was even superior to his. Moreover, he could also feel some resistance in their skin when he stabbed them. Jake was beginning to realize that he was nothing special on the scale of all mankind. After all, statistically, 1 person in 50 had an IQ over 130, and many more had practiced martial arts, or performed trades requiring martial skills that he could not decently acquire in a few months, even with a device like the Oracle. Not to mention the military, mercenaries, smugglers and other mafia groups who lived this daily. The more he killed, the more he realized that these people he thought were a simple coalition of criminals at the beginning were in fact much more organized and competent than he had imagined. Finally, after 7 or 8 tents, Jake found an empty tent with Sophie and Loanna naked and tied up, with several bruises and contusions. At first glance, nothing irreversible had happened to them yet. When they saw a man's silhouette entering the tent, they cried out in fright. As luck would have it, Jake's criminals had had the good bad idea to gag them. "Shoo, it's me," he whispered again. "I've come to set you free. Where are Amy and Sarah?" After having untied them and removed their gag, Loanna explained the situation with an incoherent speech, clearly in shock. Losing her fingers, then what had just happened to them finally made her crack. With Sophie's help and after a while he finally got the gist of it. Amy had suddenly gone into berserk mode and knocked out 2 of their attackers, which had caused her to get knocked out in response and take a good beating. After that, one of the guys mentioned that she was a special talent and ordered her to be taken to the chief's pavilion. As for Sarah, another man had dragged her into his tent as soon as they arrived here without them being able to do anything. Unfortunately, he couldn't afford to search all the tents. The gunman could have come back at any time now. On the other hand, if Amy was unconscious next to their leader, he would have to jump into the lion's den if he wanted to save her. "Where are our food and backpacks?" he asked in a hurry. In their leader's tent." Loanna stuttered between hiccups with great difficulty, struggling to return to her normal state. The choice was no longer possible. His and Will's backpacks were all they had left. Saving them without getting their supplies back would only postpone the inevitable. No choice. "I'll have to take my chances. Take their weapons if you find any, I'll create a diversion. The first shot you hear, run away and get what you can from the empty tents. Kyle, stay with the girls." The playboy gladly accepted, for the moment both glad and disappointed that he was useless. The women equipped themselves with bats and knives that Kyle had picked up behind Jake. The latter then escaped from the tent first, sneaking in behind the central pavilion. Sticking his ear to the canvas, he heard men's voices arguing about something. Their squad of shooters was late. Chapter 67. Who is the hunter? Who is the prey? You are listening at novelfull.audio. "Boss, what the hell is Lamine doing?" a man with an island accent complained. "He should have been back long ago." BDNV. Knowing him, he must be enjoying himself like a little fool. "It's been a long time since he's had such a good time." Another lower male voice with an accent that Jake thought was African replied. "Bang. Ta-ta-ta. Bang. He's having fun, but his shots are getting closer and closer and our ammunition isn't infinite." A third voice intervened after a short silence. "Indeed." The second voice grumbled in response. He was simply to attack the humans without faction and neutralize any possible threats. "Most of our men have already returned with their spoils. His tardiness worries me." Ta-ta-ta-ta. Taking advantage of another round of fire, Jake slashed the canvas of the pavilion to get a visual feedback of the situation inside. The boss, the second voice, was a 1.9 m tall, physically fit, black man close to 40 years of age. His frizzy hair was shaved very short, his face and forearms were covered with cigarette burns, a sign of abuse and mistreatment in his youth. He wore old military clothes salvaged from the army of some African dictatorship. Medals and other pins covered his uniform. Like Jake, he had a machete in his belt and a standard military knife and a revolver. A rifle without accessories was slung across his shoulder, perhaps a Kalashnikov or an AK-47. Dated weapons. His cold bird of prey gaze and his aquiline nose gave him a severity reflecting how ruthless he must surely be with his enemies. This man had a history, but also many vices. When he saw him, Jake knew instantly that he would be a tough opponent. Alongside two other men, an African man in a similar uniform and a white man with a shaved head and wearing sunglasses at night were displaying serious expressions. Both were also equipped with the same paraphernalia and had the confidence and posture of experienced soldiers. "By the way, what's the deal with that chick you brought me?" The man who had to be the leader changed the subject. Following his gaze, Jake noticed Amy's body, also naked and unconscious. Seriously, what was wrong with these guys stripping every woman they captured? From the beginning of the kidnapping until now, it must have been a total of maybe 20 minutes. Well, apparently, when Saya kicked the kid, she went crazy and knocked him out with a good jab. The bald guy with the sunglasses chuckled back. "It was so unexpected, we had to bludgeon her down with a club. She's gonna be out cold for quite a while." "Oh. Whacking Saya in one fell swoop with her petite frame, that's pretty damn impressive. Let's check her ether level." The other soldier commented, suddenly excited. "Boss, I don't have the ether scanner, so I'll let you do the honors." "All right, let me do it." That freaked Jake out. Checking ether levels by scanning a target was possible. Without the person's consent. Without touching the bracelets. If it was dangerous for him. If he was spotted, forget the surprise effect and he would be machine-gunned by 3 professional mercenaries. His concern was confirmed, but he relaxed again soon after. To activate his scanner, their leader had to get close to Amy, less than a meter from her body. If the range was that limited, he had nothing to worry about. It's done. Average ether level 11 points, highest stats 13 points, lowest 10 points. Their leader announced with a frown, visibly confused. Even if her strength was her highest stats, that shouldn't be enough to disable Saya with a single jab. It would take a perfect blow to the temple or whiplash to do that. I doubt she had that level of skill. The report indicated that she was punching and kicking any way she could, without any special skills. Clearly an amateur. Their leader remained silent for a few seconds, pensively scratching his goatee. In this case, there's only one explanation. Their leader finally concluded with a definite tone. She's got an ether skill like Lamine. The 2 right-hand men were both shocked and envious. Lamine was already an incredible marksman before we arrived on this goddamn planet. The chief refreshed their memories. But since he awakened his perfect sight skill, he has become unfathomable. Even I would have a hard time standing up to him. As long as he has his eyes and a sniper rifle, he's invincible. Suddenly, a shapeless mass crashed against the canvas of the pavilion before rolling indoors as best it could. This one turned out to be a man in a pitiful state with short black hair and mixed skin, in his mid-30s, wearing a military uniform similar to the other 3. A huge sniper rifle, maybe a Barrett, was strapped across his shoulder, while he held in each hand an automatic machine gun. The man was dripping with sweat and running out of bullets, his long beard was pissed off and the turban that was supposed to be wrapped around the top of his skull was completely undone. This man was Lamine the marksman. The same man who took out Jake, Will and the playboy without breaking a sweat. He had no apparent wounds, but he appeared to be at the end of his life, without the composure normally expected of a battlefield veteran. Lamine. What the hell happened to you? The 3 mercenaries shouted, helping him up in a hurry. Looking haggardly, the sniper tried in vain to come to his senses after his aerobatics and rough landing. Shaking his head and slapping himself to wake up, he finally remembered the mess they were in. Yerode, we've got to get out of here now, or we're all dead. We should never have made a move tonight. When Lamine spoke, he had a slight accent that Jake didn't recognize, but the tremor in his voice, thinner than usual, indicated how serious the threat was. His leader, the one called Yerode, had absolute confidence in his best shooter and made the decision immediately. Let's get out of here. Get what you can. He gave the order in a manner that would not tolerate any refusal. What about the rest of our men? The bald white man asked. We'll leave them behind as a diversion. Yerode decided with a grim face that made their blood run cold. Yerode had many faults, but if he was still alive today, it was mainly because he always put his own survival above all else. Within seconds, the quartet picked up their pre-prepared backpacks before rushing out the door. Unfortunately, luck was not on their side. The bald man in sunglasses who led the way barely managed to put 1 foot out before being sent flying in the opposite direction at the speed of a rifle bullet through the pavilion canvas. Holy shit! Jake and the 3 mercenaries watched the scene, frozen in terror. Even in front of the giant bear and the Digestinite, he hadn't felt death so close. Showing their experience as veterans, the still-living trio quickly came to their senses, raining a cloud of bullets down on the newcomer at the entrance to the pavilion. The problem was that in front of them, there was nothing. The bullets ricocheted off an intangible form, a sign that their bullets were hitting the mark, but no roar of pain or spurt of blood told them that their shots were working. Keep firing backwards. We'll escape through the hole Theo opened for us against his will, God bless his soul. Their leader bellowed, trying to cover the sound of the bullets with his voice. Once inside the pavilion and under the fire of the still-lit smartphone flash, the enemy revealed itself to them. It was a humanoid creature more than 2 meters tall, massively muscular with a membranous obsidian skin. It seemed to be equipped with a helmet shaped like the head of some indescribable monster. Underneath, a huge gaping mouth with thousands of teeth like a lamprey. No eyes but thousands of luminescent dendrites as hair from a few centimeters to several meters long, smelling and perceiving the environment around it, as if each one had a life of its own. An armor in an unknown metal protected the vital parts of the creature, including a breastplate, arm guards, leggings and shoulder pads. The creature held a sort of black blade that seemed to grow from an accessory above its wrist. The dendrites acting as hair were deflecting the bullets non-stop. After a short time, the creature seemed to adapt to the new environment. The dendrites wrapped around its body and like a perfect chameleon, the alien became invisible again, blending into the scenery. The newcomer, satisfied, emitted an ultrasonic roar that shattered his eardrums. Then, as if provoked, it charged at more than 100 kilometers an hour towards the 3 mercenaries. "Oh, God, forgive." The other African mercenary didn't even have time to say his last prayers as the creature rammed him with all its weight, the dendrites riddling him with thousands of holes in an instant before tearing him to pieces. Yerode and Lamine had not once looked back, taking advantage of their accumulation of ether to gain as much distance as possible. The alien roared again before leaping in pursuit. Amy's unconscious body had been completely ignored from start to finish. As for Jake, like the playboy earlier, he was playing dead. Chapter 68 Femme Fatale. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Several minutes after the alien leapt in pursuit and the sounds of gunfire became distant, only then did Jake dare to stop faking his death. Cautiously, he slowly got up and looked around. A few meters behind the tent, the bald white man in sunglasses was living his last moments. After being blown into the air by such a monster, the bones of his body were broken through and through, and he suffered a lot of internal bleeding. To Jake's surprise, the alien had ignored the dying prey, preferring to pursue the 2 faster leaders who had escaped first. Which made no sense to him. The only reason to hunt other creatures besides food was to steal resources or acquire ether. Any other reason wasn't rational. As ferocious as this alien may seem, its equipment, strength and technology was a sign of a highly evolved and technologically advanced extraterrestrial species. In other words, if the 2 mercenaries didn't have anything special on them, it meant that the creature was hunting them for sport. If Jake pushed the reasoning further, it meant that by attacking the humans without a faction that night, they had drawn attention to them from these aliens, which would never have happened if they had stayed warm and cozy in their camp. Earlier in the day when they arrived at the foot of the red cube, Jake had sensed hostile glances as he executed the primitive alien human who had challenged him to a duel. Perhaps if he had shown more direct physical and martial prowess, instead of relying on the advantage of his gun, he would have been the one attacked that night. Just thinking about it, he was shivering. He was also certain about another detail. This alien didn't have that much ether. He couldn't verify it, but his instincts told him that somehow the body of this humanoid was simply monstrously superior to them. Jake hadn't forgotten the crucial information about his body status that loudly proclaimed, inferior humanoid species. As time went by, he relied more on his ether status, which reflected the overall amplification of his stats compared to the normal human. Body status was different, since it depended on the genetic code and the laws of physics. Training physically or mentally, for example, could not improve the speed of reaction beyond a certain limit. In other words, the perception of time was the same for everyone, more or less. Bonus info. Children see time passing in slow motion 1.1 times slower than adults. Elderly people process information more slowly and see time passing faster. What changed in top athletes, or martial artists, were the reflexes. Reflexes were programmed to respond to situations without going through the conscious brain. This meant that no matter how much agility or intelligence the body status showed, its reaction speed would not change or would change only slightly. At least as long as he was human. If this alien had a body 10 times stronger than a human, titanium bones, metal fibers for muscle, and a brain calculating faster than a supercomputer, then with only 10 points of ether he could pulverize a human with several times the amount of ether. It was a fundamental boundary separating two species at different evolutionary levels. Something impossible to overcome unless the ether advantage became overwhelming or somehow we could evolve beyond human genetic limits. In any case, concern about this issue in the present situation was futile. Dealing with and solving problems one by one as they arise was Jake's new motto. And for a renowned former procrastinator like him, it was no small feat. As a good opportunistic scavenger, Jake took advantage of the fact that the bald mercenary was drawing his last breath to amass a sizable amount of ether on his corpse. 7 points. That was the largest amount of ether he ever got in one go. That meant that this man was as strong as a rank 3 theoretical digester. No wonder he survived a percussion like that. If Jake had gotten him to drink digester blood, he might even have made it out alive. He suspected the leaders of this mercenary group had monopolized the ether, forbidding their men to absorb it directly from their victims. It was the only logical way to explain how such stats were possible. Unless, of course, they fought to the death against an army of monsters. But if that was the case, Jake was certain they would never have gotten away with it. Their firearms were sorely lacking in numbers. The last possibility was that the group of criminals had many more men in the beginning and that the dead had allowed the living to evolve faster. A mass execution was not impossible either. If Jake, Amy, and Will could settle for farm animals, so why not these criminals on their fellow humans? Satisfied, Jake cautiously entered the tent to find the disoriented Amy, slowly coming to her senses. When she saw his face in the light of the flash of the smartphone still on in the pavilion, she immediately covered her private parts with a cute cry of panic. "What the hell happened?" she said, trying to recall the events. "I remember trying to defend the kid, nothing after that." "Well, basically you got knocked out, then brought in here and stripped like all the other women camped out next to us," Jake explained. The majority of the men were either severely injured or killed. The kid's okay, but he took a pretty good blow to the head. "Oh, that's good to hear." Amy breathed a sigh of relief. "Can I have my clothes?" Jake realized the kidnapped women's clothes were indeed in the pavilion next to the mercenaries' loot. Also present were the backpacks of supplies that had been stolen from them. "Gentlemen," but unable to recognize her clothes amidst the pile, he gave her some privacy and decided to turn around. This didn't stop him from asking a few questions to save time, which made the young woman extremely uncomfortable about having to change a few meters away from a man who could turn around at the slightest pretext. She had been unconscious, but had apparently come to her senses several minutes ago, feigning unconsciousness to avoid drawing attention to herself. Sure enough, Jake and Kyle weren't the only Oscar-winning actors tonight. "Sarah. I don't know either. I was already unconscious. I heard their leader jokingly mention a guy named Joey who had gone to taste the quality of tonight's loot. Apparently they were unhappy that he'd gone off to have fun without them. If that's Sarah, you've got to save her right now." Jake frowned, baffled by her reaction. Even this morning, they seemed to hate each other. Maybe there was some kind of universal female solidarity about these things. "All right, I will," he promised. "But there's one person no one told me about tonight. Where's the kid's mother?" Remembering something, Amy's face decayed from grief. Jake knew right away that something terrible had happened. "When they attacked us and knocked the kid out, she went crazy. Halfway to their camp, one of the guys hit her on the head with a bat, and she didn't get up after that. There was blood everywhere. I think she's dead. I got knocked out right after that." Jake closed his eyes for a moment and massaged his temples. It was his second failure of the evening. The first was being shot like a rookie. The second was that he couldn't save that woman in time, leaving a kid an orphan. Nevertheless, it was time to move on. He had done his best and he didn't owe these people anything. He would do his best to save Sarah, even though it was probably already too late. Once Amy was dressed, he entrusted her with their provisions, the poor young woman disappearing almost completely under all the bags. Her frenzy skill was still active under stress, and she managed to carry everything as best she could. He showed her the position of their camp before separating at the entrance to the pavilion. The camp was in turmoil. The appearance of the alien and the gunfire had driven everyone away, prisoners and criminals alike. It was silent and empty now. But this did not deter Jake, and he searched the empty tents and pavilions one by one. When there were only a few left to search, he found a naked Sarah covered in blood in one of them. The body of a naked man lay nearby, drained of blood by multiple stab wounds. Opposite, a Sarah sitting in shock, her knees bent against her chest, held a military knife, probably snatched from her victim, with a ferocious beastly expression on her face. He couldn't tell if the mercenary had managed to dip his biscuit, but for sure it didn't end well for him. He was discovering Sarah in a new light tonight. The woman had character. Chapter 69. It was a long night. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A few minutes earlier, Amy, Sarah, Sophie and Loanna were stripped naked and thrown like sacks of potatoes in the middle of a tent under the perverse laughter of their kidnappers, whose features they could not see clearly in the ambient darkness. Finally getting some respite, bound, naked and gagged in the middle of a basic tent, the four women found themselves abandoned to all sorts of anguish. Even before they had time to foment any kind of plan, a man with the look of a lecherous beast entered the tent, palpated them one by one as if he was weighing melons in the market, before resting his choice on the young blonde with voluptuous curves. Baffled and panicked, Sarah was torn from her friends without being able to say or do anything. She was dragged through the cold sand on what she thought was about 30 meters before being thrown headfirst into another tent. The thug was undoubtedly excited and impatient, and she could hear him unbuttoning his belt behind her, then taking off his pants before throwing his full weight on her, eager to satisfy his impulses. Still tied up and unable to resist, Sarah's brain was in full swing, thinking like never before. Then she remembered that she had an oracle device dedicated to solving exactly this kind of situation. Sarah was a selfish and arrogant young woman, manipulating men to achieve her ends, while giving them what they wanted from her. A great man once said, "Loving someone is all about loving yourself." When one fell in love with the ideal person capable of satisfying one's deepest needs. Need for affection, tenderness, sex. Affinities of character, humor and hobbies for sociability. Ideal beauty to generate attraction. When a man or woman cheated on their husbands or wives, it was because their needs had changed and were no longer satisfied. In the same way, when the woman or man you were madly in love with dumped you, the only reaction would be sadness, resentment and sometimes anger or hatred. Whoever really loved unconditionally, should in fact just be happy for that person and wish him or her the best. Impossible, right? Sarah understood that. Men loved her for her looks, her bed skills or her laughter, and she loved them for the money, pleasure, usefulness or reputation they would bring her. She had slept with many men to get what she wanted, not always very handsome, but she had never been forced to. In the 22nd century, sayings like, "The key that opens all locks is good, a lock that can be opened by all keys is trash," had long since fallen into oblivion. Macho or racist judgment still existed, but on the whole morals had evolved in the right direction. Sarah had never felt dirty or unclean and had never felt any shame for her actions. The end justified the means. Struggling and squeezing her legs as best she could, she suddenly realized that her impatient wannabe rapist couldn't get it up. The offender was apparently a long-time cocaine addict and had been suffering violent withdrawal symptoms since arriving on B842. One of the main consequences was high cortisol levels and impotence. Realizing that this was her chance, she consulted her oracle to exploit this loophole. The path revealed itself to her and she committed herself to it without hesitation. Hearing him actively masturbating to awaken his lazy worm, she crawled cautiously towards him, doing her best with her bound hands and feet, then straightening up on her knees pretended to jerk him off with both hands. Surprised by her initiative at first, the rapist relaxed, thinking that she had fallen under his spell, or that she was one of those girls with submissive fantasies. For a while, only his groans of pleasure were heard in the tent. Unfortunately, this mistake proved fatal to him. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. A burst of fire in the middle of the camp startled the excited man. Taking advantage of the diversion, she followed her shadow guide to the letter. Without mercy, she grabbed his testicles delicately, then squeezed with all her might. A sound of grapes bursting under the pressure resounded inside the tent, followed by a heart-rending cry of pain. BDNV. While the man was cowering and paralyzed by the paroxysmal pain, Sarah crawled at full speed to the criminal's belt in total darkness as if she could see in broad daylight. Drawing a long knife from his belt, she came back to the agonizing man, and with a loud scream of rage stabbed the blade into his heart. After this first stab, she continued to stab him repeatedly, venting all her accumulated fear and anger. After a while, long after the man had drawn his last breath and a filament of ether had appeared above his body, she calmed down. Then, realizing the horror of the crime she had just committed and the sticky blood covering her, she tucked her knees against her chest in a corner of the tent, convinced that she was a goner once her crime was discovered. That's how Jake discovered her when he entered the tent. He couldn't distinguish her clearly, but the clouds blocking out the light from the purple moons and stars had begun to dissipate, allowing a few thin rays of moonlight to pass through. At last he could see something, though very little. Gently tapping her shoulder to see how she was doing, he was rewarded in response with a stab to the heart, which he easily neutralized by grasping her wrist. If he hadn't controlled his strength, he would have broken her forearm. "It's me, Jake," he said, as he made her drop the knife. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized his voice. Sarah never thought she would be glad one day to hear it again. Getting her hope back, she regained in an instant the expression of a confident and smug woman. Jake was amazed at how quickly the change in attitude had occurred. He then removed her gag and undid her restraints. He then let her pick up the murder weapon and absorb the ether she had earned. "Okay, follow me now. We're going back to our tent," he commanded her in the same lackluster tone with which he addressed them during the day. Without knowing why, she found this indifference reassuring this time. The return to their camp went smoothly, and the duo found Amy and the other girls unharmed, along with Kyle and Will. The child was still unconscious inside the tent. Amy then gave Sarah her clothes back and Jake removed the bullet from Will's thigh. Digester's blood had done its job well and he had to reopen the wound to remove it. After that, he sutured and bandaged the wound before moving on to the Playboy's injury. Then when things finally settled down, he checked his own gunshot wound to the shoulder and realized that apart from a scar that promised to be quite nasty, healing was on the right track. The increase in his stats had had the desired effect. As the other exhausted members of his group went back to bed, huddling together inside the tent despite the lack of space, Jake went for a walk again. Now that visibility was decent again thanks to the starlight and moonlight, Jake retraced his steps to the mercenary camp, hoping to find the child's mother and check on her condition for good. He found her body easily, lying in the sand a few dozen meters from their own base. After all this time, she still hadn't woken up, and seeing how her face was half buried in the sand, it didn't bode well. Turning the body over, he checked her pulse and breath. Nothing. Touching gently the back of the deceased's skull, he felt his fingers digging into her skull like a broken pottery jar. With a long sigh, he searched her, looking for a memento for the child. Eventually he found her smartphone turned off, which he decided to bring back. If there was one item that could hold family photos, it was this one. In the mirror universe, there had to be a way to charge or retrieve the data inside, even without the approved charger. Finding nothing else of value, he undertook to bury her with dignity. If the child fell on her corpse when he woke up, it would be a disaster, and out of respect for this woman, he could not let her either to rot in the sand or end up as a nocturnal snack for a group of scavenging aliens. When night gave way to dawn, he finally returned to his camp, mentally prepared to face many more nights like this one. But just as he was getting ready to eat something to recover from his night adventures, the giant red cube started flashing wildly, emitting a piercing noise that stirred up all the creatures.